Two victories with the white color and two draws. That is the outcome of the third round of the GMT tournament here in the 56th International Biel Chess Festival. So let's have a look what happened in this very interesting round. We are going to start with a game of David Navarra against Jules Mossar. So after knight f3, knight f6, c4, here the Czechman found a very interesting way to avoid some lines in the Catalan. D takes on c4, the Frenchman accepted white's pawn. Then after c6, he based his strategy on positioning the light square bishop on b7 as quickly as possible. After queen c4, b5, queen c2, bishop b7, Black's idea is pretty obvious. He wants to play a6, knight e7, perhaps queen b6 and play c5. Here, obviously, white has a number of choices how to continue. White continue with rook d1, knight e7, bishop g5, clearly hinting at some point to take on f6 and losing Black's control of the c5 square. Mossar was accurate. He played queen b6. Knight e2 perhaps is not really the strongest move in this position, but it definitely looked very interesting because once again, if Black plays here c5, there's a very powerful move, knight e5, and after the game, Jules would say that this is the reason why he didn't want to go here, because all the variations are basically in favor of white. So that's why after rook d8, a4, Navarra tried to slow down Black's progress at a queen side, but still c5 works really well. A takes, queen b5, queen b3 was the final attempt of white to gain any advantage, but after the very precise queen trade and bishop d5, the position simply equalized. So Navarra entered an endgame which he thought he has some chances to push. In the game interview, his opponent disagreed. He said if somebody can play this position for Black, it was if somebody could play this position for the victory, it can only be Black, because he wants to play rook b5 and attack the pawn on b2. And after the game, Navarra also confessed that he simply missed this opportunity for Black to play e5, e4, and he already had to requalify as a defender and seek some tactical chances. The game continued. Nothing really dramatic was happening here. You see the pawn on b4 cannot be taken because there's a fork on d5. So although Black won this pawn on b4, his kingside pawns are pretty weak. And after a couple of maneuvers, David was able to capture some of them and have at least some chances to fight for the victory because the pawn on e4 is difficult to defend. The critical moment arose here when the Czech grandmaster found some very nice tricky order with the moves to push the Black king back. And after king g3, he already was seriously threatened to play knight c3, knight takes on e4, win this pawn, maybe rook h4. So that's why the Frenchman decided to force things and sacrifice the bishop for the two pawns and claim a theoretical draw, even if white wins the remaining two pawns. The game could have finished right here, although Navarra was pressing for 50 moves. In the end, a draw was a logical outcome. Yu Yanyi again had a very long day, probably the longest day so far. Again, it was basically deja vu what he had played against Arjun Erigaisi. He missed the victory a couple of times. This time it was against Daniel Bogdan Diak. They chose Nimzo, which transposed the Rogozin, very popular line. Here there was a theoretical struggle. Queen d3 is the main move in this position. a6, d takes on c5, which appeared to be slightly surprising for his opponent, although all of this already had been played before. Queen trade, bishop takes, bishop c3 is necessary, otherwise white simply plays b4. Knight a5 was a very good move, threatening to play bishop d7, maybe rook c8, try to capitalize on these weaknesses. Knight e2, and here Black perhaps made an accuracy. Bishop d7 was looking just fine. Instead, here the remaining grandmaster decided to grab the pawn immediately. Here, white found a very nice resource, c6, sacrificing the pawn back, but winning some critical tempi. After knight c6, a4, white was just in time to bring the bishop in the game and claim some advantage. All of this happened, knight c4, and here Black made a rather strange choice. He decided to play knight a5, which we didn't really like, and during the commentary we felt that there was no reason to do that. a5, bishop a6 was just looking fine. Eventually, white managed to activate his bishops. Although black won the pawn on a4, you could definitely feel that the bishop power is pretty significant. The Chinese grandmaster continued to increase the pressure, and eventually it resulted for him winning the pawn on a4, basically for no compensation. So he has an extra pawn and two bishops. However, during this time, Diak managed to build up a considerable fortress. From here, things started to go wrong for the Chinese grandmaster because he was seeking to create a second weakness at the king side, but he missed this one moment when Diak was forcing a bishop trade. And if white wanted to have a serious progress, he should have avoided that. And for example, here, try to keep the both bishops on the board and play bishop d3. He played king d2, and after bishop d3, the defense became much simpler for black. After bishop c1, rook b5, here the Chinese grandmaster decided to sacrifice the pawn. Perhaps this was not the best choice. What he could have done after bishop c1, here there was a very nice trick to play e4, takes, rook takes e4, rook c5, and rook g4, attacking this pawn from unexpected g4 square. Instead, he played rook a8 and rook g8, thinking he is winning the pawn on g7. However, after a very precise defense, rook d7, knight e8, if bishop f8, there's knight e6. In the end, white's advantage slipped away, and he did not manage to win back the pawn. The game continued for a while. The Chinese grandmaster was pressing. He was trying to find cracks in black's defenses. And a critical moment arose when Diak was in time trouble. He put the knight on d1, and one couldn't help but feel that this is the final chance for the Chinese grandmaster to win the game. Now, after e takes on f3 was a gift for white, a rook b7, and here f4, here Yu Yanyi finally let his final chance slip away. What he had to do is to play king g2, knight b2, king g3, activating the king. And after bishop a1, black would have to lead very difficult defense. Rook c3 check is very unpleasant. Also king f4, king f5 is a threat. Also rook a8, rook g8 is something that black cannot miss. Instead, all of this was unfortunately missed by white. And here in the end, this position reached a position where black is still slightly passive, holding on, but white simply cannot make a progress, and a draw was agreed shortly. Then we had two more decisive games, and Vincent Kammerer was facing the last year's triathlon winner, like Wang Liyem, who just scored the victories in a row. The game transposed to symmetrical Grunfeld. Here c4, a4. Vincent once again showed his excellent preparation in opening. Knight e4 is the main move here, inviting white to play queen c2, knight e6, e4, and then something like knight a6, having some dynamic counter chances. For this particular game, Kammerer had prepared to play knight c3. And in the previous games, most of the games would continue with knight e6. White still keeps some advantage, but black manages to keep the pawn on c4. Black opted for a more rare continuation knight c3, which is still fine. B takes, shoot castle, a5 was a nice move by the young German, claiming space advantage, thinking about queen a4. c5, queen a4, knight c6, black played in the spirit of the Grunfeld. Rook d1, c takes. Yeah, knight e4 first, of course, opening the bishop. Knight e4, c takes. So far, this was the perfect chess. Here, black already had some choices. Bishop g4 is perfectly normal, opening the bishop, bringing it in the game, and threatening to win the pawn on e2. Rook a2, a quiet move to defend it. Rook c8, black sacrificed the pawn on b7. Rook c7, a6, and here arose the critical moment. It was pretty difficult for black to navigate in these complex positions, so perhaps the simplest choice he could have done is to play bishop d7 and try to play bishop c6. For example, queen b4, bishop c6 with a threat to take on b7, queen b8, and eliminate this very dangerous pawn. Because if he does not do that, the black pawn on a7 now is in serious danger. Another very interesting option that black had was to play bishop takes on d4, but this would lead to very complex position because here you see you always need to watch out for e3, although this immediately is not possible because the white rook on d1 is under attack. And after bishop h6, black could have sacrificed an exchange with queen d6, again leading to a very, very sharp game. It did not happen. Here the Vietnamese grandmaster played c3, which probably is a dubious move. And after bishop f4, it already was pretty difficult for him to pick up the right move, which was, again, something else, but not rook d7. Bishop d7 still was a possibility here, but it does not look very human. Now here, he played rook d7, and after d5, suddenly it's very difficult to stop bishop e3, attacking for the white queen the bishop on g4, and also threatening with bishop takes on a7. Bishop f5 was a mistake in a difficult position. Bishop e3, now white is also threatening to play g4 to trap the bishop. The pawn on a7 is under attack. And after c2, white simply sacrificed exchange, having a technically winning position. However, after queen a5, suddenly Winston didn't pick up the strongest move here, which was queen c5, forcing a queen trade, trading the queens and winning the pawn on a7, which would simply give him a winning position. Instead, he played queen b3, perhaps slightly underestimating Black's possible idea to sacrifice the exchange. Rook d6, threatening to take on a6. White stopped that. Black insisted. And in the end, White did win the exchange, leaving the position to a rather unbalanced situation where White has obstacle bishops and an extra pawn. But in the end, the position was too strong for White in order not to win this game. Queen d4, I guess, was the final mistake. White slowly advanced forward and very confidently won the game. There was a bit curious moment when at some moment Keimer missed a mate in two. He could have played rook b8, king e7, rook e8, checkmate, but it didn't change the outcome. And his opponent resigned 6 moves later. And the final game of the round is of Amin Bassem against Arjun Rigaisi, where Amin remained true to his kings in an attack, one of his most favorite weapons. After the classical setup here, knight e2, c5, e4, knight c6, rook e1. Obviously, Black has a number of choices. Here, Arjun decided to follow his game against Eric Blomqvist earlier this year. D takes, e5. Engines support this idea. However, it does weaken d5 square for reasons unknown. After c3, h3 was a very smart waiting move. As Amin in the interview would say, he was waiting for Black to define his setup. For example, h6, which would happen in the game, allows him to play knight h4. And then after knight f5, it's difficult for Black to get rid of this knight. Bishop e6, knight c4, and apparently b5 was not a good move. If Black wanted to play bishop f8, it had to be done right now, because then after bishop f8, White has no access to queen f3 because the knight on c4 is hanging. Now instead here, the young Indian played the very tempting b5, knight e3. Apparently he cannot really play c4, a4, a6 because he has some issues with the d5 square. After this trade, knight e5 is very unpleasant. And that's why he played rook b8. But now, after knight f5 and another logical response, bishop f8, queen f3 suddenly is very strong because knight takes on h6 is quite difficult to parry. The knight on f6 for Black remains under attack. So bishop takes on f5 was another inaccuracy in a already unpleasant position. And after knight takes on f5, nobody could question that White has an advantage. So he wants to play h4, g4, g5, start the kingside attack. Black played rook b6, trying to solve his problems in a tactical way that White cannot win the knight on f6. After a4, yet another inaccuracy by Rigaisi. a6 was still necessary here with a quite unpleasant position, but holdable. Knight e7, again, a mistake in a difficult position. And after the simple a takes on b5, e takes on e5, White got 2 very powerful bishops. Rook b5, queen c6, queen b8. Here, Bassem showed his great tactical skills. He found a beautiful resource. Rook a7, Black takes on a7, then White captures rook on b5, rook b2, and beautiful rook f7, because king f7 would be a mate on the board. Rook b6, another nice move, rook b7, forcing trades. And from here, this was just a technique for the strong Egyptian grandmaster. The game continued for a while. His bishops were too strong. He activated his rooks. Then managed to create a pass pawn, and eventually all of Black's pawns fall like dominoes, and Black did not hold for long. Results of round 3, Winston Keimer beat Kwang Liem. Also, Amin Bassem managed to score very important 4 points against Arjun Rigaisi, who's been having a rather disappointing tournament so far. Yu Yanyi let again the victory slip away, drawing against Daniel Bogdandiak, and David Navarre against Jules Massard was a balanced draw. These are the rankings after the third round of the classical tournament. Vincent Kammer and David Navarre, they have identical results both in the rapid tournament and the classical. This means they're leading the tournament with 17 points each. Yu Yanyi now is behind slightly with 3.5 points. Le Quang Liem has dropped to the 4th place with 13 points. However, Amin Bassem is not very far behind. The action will resume today with the round 4 of the classical portion. It starts at 2 p.m. Central European Summer Time. Again, we are going to see a lot of exciting action. The last round before the Blitz tournament. Come back here, watch it live, and enjoy it.